Venice sits on a hilltop. Cyprus is no longer an island. Rome has a beach 300 kilometers to its south. A new continent has grown between Europe and Africa. 660,000 square kilometers of new farmland, larger than France. 20 million new hectares that belonged to no country in 1928. It should exist. The plans were finished. The engineering worked. The concrete was ready. Then Germany chose war instead. Almost built. Case number 023. The sea that was supposed to disappear. Herman Sörgel was 43 years old in the winter of 1928. He was an architect in Munich. His firm designed apartment buildings and small factories. Nobody had ever heard of him outside Bavaria. He was obsessed with peace. Sörgel had lived through the First World War as a young man in Berlin. He watched what starvation did to a city. He watched the peace treaty of Versailles crush his country. He watched Weimar Germany starve again in the winter of 1923, while men in tuxedos negotiated debt in Paris. He decided the entire continent needed to be redesigned, physically, from the ground up. A colleague who reviewed his early drawings said, Sörgel talked about cities the way most architects talk about doorways. He designed civilizations, not buildings. In November 1928, Sörgel published a small book at his own expense. He printed 3,000 copies. He mailed 140 of them to newspapers, universities, and industrial magnates across Germany, France, Italy, and Britain. The book had one central idea. If Europe could drain the Mediterranean Sea, it would gain more usable land than any colonial empire had ever conquered. It would generate more hydroelectric power than all the coal mines of the continent combined. And most importantly, it would force every European nation to work together on a single project so large that war between them would become logistically impossible. Sörgel called the plan Atlantropa, a single continent stretching from Norway to South Africa. He believed peace could be engineered. He believed the sea could be moved. The idea landed on Europe at the exact right moment. The First World War had killed 17 million people. Everyone alive in 1928 had lost someone. The generation that survived was hungry for anything that promised the war would never come back. Utopian engineering was the fashion of the decade. Le Corbusier was designing cities like machines. Buckminster Fuller was drawing houses that hung from cables. Soviet planners were about to redraw 11 time zones with a 5-year plan. Europeans in 1928 believed men could rebuild the world. The Weimar economy was recovering. American loans were pouring into German industry. The Reichsmark had stabilized. For the first time since 1914, ordinary Germans could imagine 10 years into the future without panicking. Hydroelectric power was the miracle of the age. Hoover Dam had just begun construction in Nevada. The Dnieper Dam in Ukraine was rising. Every industrialized country wanted a dam larger than its neighbors. And there was something else. Africa in 1928 was still divided among European empires. Britain owned Egypt and half the continent's east coast. France ruled the Sahara. Italy held Libya. Germany had been stripped of every African colony by the Versailles Treaty and wanted them back. Sörgel's plan quietly promised a way to reopen the entire continent to European settlement without firing a shot. Just drain the sea, walk across, claim the land. Nobody said it that directly in public. Everyone thought it, which is why, when the first 140 copies of the book went out in November 1928, they were read within a week. Newspapers in 6 countries printed excerpts. 2 Berlin publishers offered Sörgel a proper commercial edition. The German Chamber of Engineers requested a private lecture. By spring 1929, Atlantropa was the most discussed engineering proposal in Europe. Then October arrived. Here's what almost was. October 29, 1929. Wall Street collapsed in 6 hours. $25 billion vanished in a single afternoon. American loans to Germany stopped the next week. The Reichsmark did not stabilize this time. It collapsed. 6 million Germans lost their jobs within 18 months. Political extremists doubled their vote in every regional election. Nobody in Berlin was funding utopian engineering anymore. Sörgel refused to stop. He self-published a second book in 1931, then a third in 1932. He hired a small team of draftsmen out of his own pocket. He gave free lectures to any audience that would listen. He drafted letters to every industrialist who still had money left. Most of them replied politely and did nothing. But 3 men wrote back seriously. A Hamburg shipping magnate offered a small monthly stipend. A Milanese cement industrialist offered engineering consultants. And a Bauhaus architect named Peter Behrens agreed to design the coastal cities that would rise on the drained basin. Sörgel now had a team, a tiny one, but real. The engineering problem started at Gibraltar. The strait between Spain and Morocco is 14 kilometers wide. On its narrowest day, it is 900 meters deep. The Atlantic pours through it into the Mediterranean at a rate of 1 million cubic meters per second. Because the Mediterranean evaporates faster than its rivers replace it, this inflow is constant, every day, for 9,000 years. Stop that inflow, Sörgel argued, and the Mediterranean would evaporate approximately 1.5 meters per year on its own. The problem was building a dam 900 meters deep against a saltwater river the size of the Amazon. Nobody had built anything close. Sörgel's engineers proposed a hollow concrete structure poured in sections and floated into position, then sunk and filled with rock. The dam would be 35 kilometers long, not 14. It would arc from Cape Trafalgar in Spain to the northern coast of Morocco, spreading the water pressure across a longer curve. At its base, the dam would be 900 meters thick. The Hoover Dam is 200 meters thick. The number went out in a technical journal in 1934. Every engineer who read it laughed. Then most of them stopped laughing. Then a meteorologist ruined everything. A young Austrian climate scientist named Wilhelm Schmidt read Sörgel's plans and wrote a 50-page rebuttal. Sörgel's basin, once drained, would become a superheated desert. Summer temperatures in the exposed seabed would reach 70 degrees Celsius. The evaporating salt would poison 100 kilometers of soil in every direction. The Mediterranean climate, the mild winters that grew olives and citrus across southern Europe, would end within a decade. Sörgel had not thought about weather. He revised his plan. The drained basin, he now argued, would be forested with drought-resistant trees imported from the Sahara. A series of secondary lakes would remain in the deepest parts of the old sea to moderate temperature. The Nile Delta and the Bosphorus would be enlarged to keep circulation moving. It was engineering by patch, but it worked on paper. Schmidt continued to publish objections through the 1930s. Sörgel continued to answer them. The scientific debate was healthy. The political debate was already dead. Every country that touched the Mediterranean would have to agree. That meant Italy, France, Spain, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Yugoslavia, Albania, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Cyprus, Malta, and a dozen small holdings still contested between empires. 20 nations, 20 capitals, 20 different legal codes. In 1934, they were not on speaking terms with each other. Some of them were preparing to invade each other within the decade. Sörgel proposed a supranational governing body called the Atlantropa Institute. Every participating country would send delegates. Decisions would require 2/3 majority. Individual nations could not veto. This was a decade before the United Nations existed. Nobody had ever built a governance structure at this scale in peacetime. He wrote to every foreign ministry in the region between 1932 and 1937. He received polite non-responses from most. Egypt sent a brief note declining to participate. Italy, under Mussolini, sent a formal rejection stating that Italy would never surrender sovereignty over its coastline for a German-led project. But Britain and France, quietly, began meeting to discuss it. Then Germany elected Hitler. January 30th, 1933. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within 18 months, every large engineering project in the country was reoriented toward military production. Highway systems became invasion routes. Aircraft factories tripled. Naval yards worked around the clock. Sörgel watched this with horror. He was not a Nazi. His entire proposal was built on international cooperation, which the new regime called weakness. His writings praised the League of Nations, which Hitler withdrew from in October 1933. He advocated peaceful expansion through engineering, which Hitler considered contemptible compared to conquest. The Nazi Party investigated Sörgel 3 times between 1934 and 1937 for potential subversion. They found nothing prosecutable. His plans were technically in Germany's national interest. He wanted new land. The Nazis wanted new land. The problem was Sörgel wanted to share it. He tried to reposition Atlantropa as a nationalist project. as the greatest engineering triumph of the German Reich. It did not work. Hitler distrusted anything that required treaties. Göring distrusted anything that took longer than a war. By 1938, Sörgel had lost every internal Nazi advocate. His government contracts were quietly canceled. He kept publishing anyway. But between the 1933 election and the war that arrived 6 years later, Atlantropa almost happened. May 1938, Milan, the International Exhibition of Modern Architecture. Sörgel had spent his last personal savings to build a scale model of the Gibraltar Dam. It was 12 meters long. The concrete arms curved between two miniature coastlines painted to match Cape Trafalgar and Tangier. Inside the model, tiny lights showed where the future turbines would sit. A small cutaway revealed the interior chambers. The exhibition ran for 6 weeks. 200,000 people paid to see it. Sörgel gave 12 public lectures in 3 languages. Le Corbusier attended one of them and wrote afterward that Atlantropa was the only European proposal of the century that could match American scale. The French delegation invited Sörgel to Paris for private meetings with the Ministry of Public Works. He went in July. The meetings produced a preliminary technical study committee. Not funding, not commitment, just a committee. But the committee was chaired by 3 prominent French engineers, 1 Belgian hydraulics expert, and, quietly, informally, 1 representative of the British Foreign Office. The proposal that emerged from those meetings suggested a 5-year feasibility study, funded jointly by France and Britain, to begin in early 1940. If the study confirmed the engineering, construction would begin in 1943 or 1944. The Gibraltar Dam would be complete by 1970. The Mediterranean would be fully drained by 2010. Sörgel returned to Munich in September 1938. He wrote in his journal that he had never in his life felt closer to seeing the project begin. He circulated the feasibility study proposal to his German backers on September 20th. On September 30th, Neville Chamberlain flew home from Munich carrying an agreement signed by Hitler that promised peace. 10 months later, the war began. The committee never convened. September 1st, 1939. German tanks crossed into Poland at 4:45 in the morning. By nightfall, the world knew a war had started that would end everything Atlantropa depended on. One war killed it. The French engineers on the study committee were called into military service within 72 hours. The British Foreign Office representative was reassigned to war planning. Peter Behrens, Sörgel's Bauhaus architect, died in Berlin in February 1940. The Hamburg shipping magnate who had funded him for a decade was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 for anti-Nazi correspondence, never seen again. Sörgel himself was too old for the army, but was drafted into civilian architectural service for the Reich. He spent the war designing bomb shelters and reconstructing bombed factories. He kept writing Atlantropa memoranda every night. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Sörgel came back to his Munich apartment and found his notes intact. He was 60 years old. His country was ruins. Every institution that could have funded his project was gone. Then something else killed the plan for good. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Within 5 years, every serious energy engineer in Europe understood that nuclear reactors would generate more electricity than any hydroelectric dam ever could. Sörgel's central selling point, free unlimited hydropower for the whole continent, became obsolete overnight. Atlantropa was still theoretically possible after 1945. It just was no longer necessary. Sörgel refused to accept this. He kept publishing until the day he died. Herman Sörgel died on December 4, 1952. He was 67 years old. He was riding his bicycle to give an evening lecture at the Technical University of Munich. The lecture was about Atlantropa. He had given some version of that same lecture 842 times over 24 years. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, on a straight and well-lit road, a car struck him from behind at high speed. The driver did not stop. Sörgel died in the hospital 7 hours later without regaining consciousness. The Munich police investigation lasted 3 weeks. No witnesses came forward. No suspect was ever identified. The case was officially closed as an unsolved hit-and-run in January 1953. His widow, Irene Sörgel, believed her husband had been assassinated. She published a short pamphlet in 1954 arguing that former Nazi officials with continuing influence in the West German construction industry had motive to silence him permanently. The pamphlet was ignored. Nobody investigated further. Nobody. Here is what the Mediterranean would look like today if Sörgel had lived and the dam had been built. The sea level would sit 200 meters below its current line. 600,000 square kilometers of new coastline would exist. Italy would be twice as large. Greece would connect physically to Turkey. Cyprus and Crete would sit on tall inland cliffs, no longer islands. The Balearic Islands would be a mountain range. Malta would be a hilltop above a river valley. Venice would be a river town, 100 kilometers from the nearest saltwater. Europe's climate would be permanently different. The mild winters that grow olives across southern France and Spain would end. The Mediterranean basin ecosystem, one of the oldest continuous cultural landscapes on Earth, would be dead. Or the plan might have failed catastrophically. Wilhelm Schmidt might have been right. The exposed seabed might have become an ecological disaster large enough to depopulate southern Europe entirely. Nobody will know. Ever. What survives is drawings. Sörgel's complete archive was donated to the Deutsches Museum in Munich after Irene's death in 1971. It contains 140,000 pages of technical drawings, correspondence, financial estimates, and revisions covering 24 years of continuous work. The archive occupies 112 linear meters of shelf space in a climate-controlled facility on the third floor. A curator at the museum described opening the archive for the first time in the 1980s and finding page after page of exquisitely detailed drawings of coastal cities that were never built. For a continent that never existed, drawn by a man nobody had heard of, ready to be handed to any builder who ever wanted to start. He said walking through the archive felt like walking through an unbuilt cathedral. The Gibraltar Dam has been proposed independently twice since 1952, once by a Spanish engineering consortium in 1975 and once by a Danish climate researcher in 2013. Both proposals were quickly abandoned. The sea still fills the basin. The blueprints still exist. Venice sits at the edge of the sea it was supposed to leave behind. Cyprus is still an island. Rome has no beach except the one the tide keeps rebuilding every century. 20 million hectares of new farmland do not exist. The continent between Europe and Africa was never born. The blueprints sit in Munich. The archive is climate-controlled. Nobody has opened Box 47 since 1994. The sea fills the basin. It always did. The dam was never built. Nobody is building it.